Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar put on by the Efficient and Healthy Schools campaign. This session is for Track 2, Emissions Reduction and Resilience. I will let them introduce themselves later, but today we have presenting Paul Torsellini from National Renewable Energy Lab and Riley Loveland-Falvey from New Buildings Institute. I'm Izzy Sigrist, Project Analyst at New Buildings Institute, and before we begin, I'm just going to let you know a couple things. So right now you are in listen only mode. I'm going to transition you to a presenter, meaning you can see the chat, you can go on video, you can go off mute. During the presentation, we ask that you do not touch mute or video controls. We want to save bandwidth, make sure you can hear the speakers okay. But at the end of the presentation, we'll hold our 30-minute office hours. At that time, you can come off video, ask your questions, chat with everybody, and we will let you know when that time is. You should also be able to see a dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have technical difficulties, can't see us, can't hear us, can't see the slides, you can use that dashboard and just let us know you're having troubles and we'll figure it out. And I wanted to mention that we are recording just the presentation part of this webinar. So if you need to leave early, view it later, send it to someone, you will be able to do that. We will cut out the discussion part. So anything you say in the discussion is private, and we encourage you to ask all your hard-hitting questions. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Riley.
Thank you, Izzy. And I'll just reiterate what Izzy said, that you all will become panelists, which means that if you do use the chat, you'll have to say like chat all panelists, because we're going to encourage you to use the chat. So just know that if you do send a private message, make sure that it gets sent, privately to somebody, and that it'll get sent to everyone, including all the panelists and everyone here. We had some minor technical difficulties with the chat last time, so this should remedy that. I see you all being made panelists right now, which is great. Okay, so I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves. I think we have quite a few repeats from last time, so if you're a repeat, hold on to your hats. There's some repetitive stuff, but then there's also some amazing new content. So appreciate you all for being here. Again, this is the first webinar in the emissions reductions and resilience. That's me, that's Paul. I'm gonna have everybody hop on really quickly because I want you all to meet the Efficient and Healthy Schools team. Just really quickly, because we are your resources. I guess I should put myself on here too. We are your people resources to help support you through this planning track and through other aspects of the campaign. So like Izzy said, I'm Riley Loveland-Falvey, and I am in Portland, Oregon. I'm a senior project manager here at New Buildings Institute. Izzy, you're next on my screen. I know you introduced yourself, but why don't you go ahead?
Yes, good to see you. Also with New Buildings Institute, also Portland, Oregon. And I'll pass it to Amy.
Hi, everybody. Amy Cortese, Program Director at NBI. And NBI is located in Portland, Oregon. I happen to be there now, but I am from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania these days. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Emma.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Riccardi. I'm a project analyst with NBI, and I'm located in the Bay Area in California.
Renji, you want to go next?
Sure. Ranji Chen, I'm a staff scientist leading the Efficient and Healthy Schools campaign. I'm also in the Bay Area. Allie?
Hello, Allie Johnson, and I work at Berkeley Lab on the campaign, and I am also in the Bay Area.
All right, and Paul is our special guest today. Paul, please introduce yourself. Uh-oh, did we lose Paul's audio? Paul, are you muted?
How's that?
That's perfection.
Okay. So Paul Torsellini, National Renewable Energy Lab. The lab is in Golden, Colorado, and kind of like LBNL, we are one of DOE's national labs focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy. I'm a principal engineer. My background is actually mechanical engineering. And I am physically today located in northeastern Connecticut, so far away, I think, from everybody else on the screen at the moment.
Paul can ground truth us as us West Coasties talk about things, and he can be like, and it works on the East Coast too. So Thanks for being here, Paul. Campaign team, y'all can turn off your cameras, or I guess we can all turn off our cameras, and then I will get on with the show. Alrighty, we don't need to stare at our faces anymore. So today's agenda, thank you for sitting through some introductions, and we'll just do a little level setting here, and then we're going to do an overview of the recognition process. Again, I know some of you are repeats, so hopefully that you'll maybe catch something new in this version, but if not, just kind of wait it out for a minute. We'll talk about making the case for emission reduction and resilience, and kind of talking about setting up the process. And then planning for carbon-free and resilient schools will come from Paul. We're so happy to have him here. And then we have that last half hour for office hours discussion, questions. We have a couple questions to lead into that, but if you have questions before that, feel free to dive in. The chat is your best resource for now. Again, if you unmute, we can absolutely mute you, but I think everybody has probably figured it out by now. And we look forward to the discussion part. All right, like I said, chat. So let's see if this works. Izzy, I saw that you did a test. If you all can introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, title, and school district, that would be great. And beyond the campaign staff here and Paul, there are only school districts in these meetings, or school districts or school representatives. I recognize we might have a couple people that represent just a school. So this stays, anything that is discussed today stays within your peer-to-peer cohort. Please give it a shot in the chat. Hopefully it works. So something to expect from this series, you'll learn about tools for achieving these carbon neutral, or schools that are working towards emissions reduction and resiliency, finding those peer-to-peer connections. Like I said, it is a room full of school districts and school representatives, accessing regional and then national technical experts like Paul. Oh, yay, it worked. Thank you, Gretchen, for testing that out. And Kathy, so happy to have you all. Having some real-time guidance, that's the office hours, or we'll also just kind of open some parts for some discussion if we need to in the middle to help develop climate appropriate goals and plans. And then last but not least, gaining national recognition. Oops. So a quick overview of the recognition process. So there are 2 tracks for recognition this year. Energy efficiency plus health is one of them. I know some of y'all were on that track, the planning series for that. And then there's also this emissions reduction and resilience, which is where we are today. And if for some reason you were not on the energy one, but you'd like to be, you can go back and listen to the earlier recording and then join us. I'll have the links for that series in just a moment. And this is especially important for this crew. There's an updated date for the next one. We pushed it back a week because we had it scheduled during the Green Schools Conference. So it'll be really fun to touch base with some of you virtually the week before, and then hopefully see you all in person in New Orleans. And if you're not going to be in New Orleans, we would still love to touch base with you after if you would like to. And here are the registration links for the planning track webinar series. We'll drop these in the chat too. You don't need to memorize them unless you really feel like it. And I'll talk about the timeline here. So here's the webinar series during the winter of this year. These go from January, February, and March, as you just saw. And then during the spring, you'll start to prepare your materials for your plan submission. And then in May 1st, or on May 1st, is when the final submission will be due. This is just for the planning track. I know some of you are familiar with the implementation track, and I will talk about that in 1 second. In your final submission, I will talk about what that looks like too. Really, it's up to you about what might be most useful for you or your school. And then in June, there'll be the recognition. There'll be an in-person event. We will figure that out as soon as we can so that we can let you all know and have you all be there. Okay, so submitting the plan, and we want to make sure that your plan is tailored to your school district needs, and we fully recognize that it may evolve over the course of this series. Like during this first one, you might be like, I want a 12-page report that focuses on emissions reduction, but then by the end, you're like, actually resilience, I think, is really where we want to go, or it's a mix of things. It's electrification and resilience. And so the goal for you is to just create an actionable plan that is not a bunch of extra busy work. I think I gave this example in the last series that, you know, one school district we talked to was like, we don't like paperwork, we just want action. So if For them, it might be just like a one pager of what they plan to do. For you, maybe you want a report for your school district or for your school board. It's entirely up to you, and we want to make sure that it's useful for you. And it can be focused on any topic or any series of topics. If you're also attending the energy series, or if you plan to now, you only need one plan for the two. So one plan that can be focused on emissions and energy. It can be focused on a particular action, like the electrification of your HVAC system, or any action that you find to be important for your district. It can be part of an existing plan, or it can be a new, larger plan focused on whole district sustainability. Like for example, you might have a plan already in process in your district, and you're like, oh gosh, I would like to have a new part that I add to that about emissions reduction. That's great. It can be in any format: PowerPoint, Word doc, one pager, infographic, preferably something written. Interpretive dance not accepted this time. So just let us know, and we can sort of help you work through what might be most effective. Okay, so that is the planning track. I'll have a second here where we can ask questions too, but then for those not necessarily familiar with this, there is also the implementation track, and that is projects that are actually done, and that you're applying for recognition to talk about those projects and gain recognition for a project that has actively been completed. That has a slightly sooner timeline. So preparation is now. There's an application online. You can see a link to it. We'll also drop it in the chat. And then, let us know if you need help. You can also, if you, let's say, did a project with someone around you, like a university or an energy services company, whatever that might look like, you can absolutely have them help you fill out the application. Or if you need help from us, please just let us know and we can support you however we can. And then the final submission for that one is due March 1st. So that one is due sooner. That one is due quite soon. So please let us know soon so that we can help support you. And then again, that same announcement in June. So planning track, this track that we're currently in, is due May 1st, a little more time. We can sort of work through it together. Implementation track due March 1st. Okay, I'm gonna stop for a second. You're welcome to unmute and ask questions or put them in the chat if you'd like to. They always say to wait until you're uncomfortable and then wait a little bit more. So I'll just give it another minute. Okay, all right, great. That means my explanation was perfect. Love it. But if you do have questions, please put them in the chat and I can answer them as we go. Okie dokie. So we're trying to set up this series. This first one is really talking about sort of putting the pieces together to develop your plan for emissions reduction and resilience. So I'm going to sort of talk about, we're going to have some continuity throughout with some key approaches, which I'll show you in a little bit. But right now, we're just going to talk about sort of what your plan might look like. So your plan might be more longer term. It might be something where, you could be a portfolio level roadmap, kind of like this one, where it looks over the long term to a certain date at the end. This is the example of, it's big pie in the sky, carbon neutral building portfolio by 2045, but maybe yours is like 80% energy reduction by 2045. Or you can see here that we have these milestones along here of 2030 to 2040. But when you're looking over the long term, you do want to consider these different building life cycle events, the new construction, what that looks like for major modernization, retrofits, and system replacement. And when you're doing this, just remember that it's not everything all at once. It is, we often call this getting to zero over time, where you are just using every opportunity you can. So you're making a plan for that when those opportunities arise, you're able to then act on them. So like your system replacements, slowly transitioning away from natural gas, for example. That's a very big one, but that's definitely an opportunity. Or in new construction, you should always be shooting for the best amount of efficiency you can, while also, doing all electric systems. So I kind of mentioned these key approaches. So it could be a plan focused on any of these common actions. These are ones that we've found that school districts commonly do. It could be any one of these. Your plan could incorporate one of these. Your plan could be just to engage your stakeholders or assess your building stock, and you set goals based on that. It could be a plan to engage your occupants in your work, to make a meaningful change. Really, it's sort of whatever, like I've said, works for your district. We're going to focus today very quickly, kind of just to set the stage, on the stakeholder engagement and messaging and sort of the visioning framework. And then throughout the series, we're going to touch on the other approaches. And Paul is going to do a really great job of sort of like pulling all these pieces together to really get your full picture of what decarbonization could look like. So what could my plan visually look like? I'm a visual learner, so I like a nice graphic. It could look like this plan from Boulder Valley. And note that this one was developed by hiring outside consultants, and it's not a typical report, but you could do something like this, absolutely. Or maybe your plan is to create a framework to find this, or to make a similar plan and find consultants to support the development of something like this. Or maybe it's something like this. It's a simpler checklist, talking about different construction events. You know, this one is for modernization specifically, where, you know, you're every time you do a project, certain things are mandatory, certain things are case by case. This was something done for Lake Tahoe Unified, and maybe it's creating specifications at both districts too, or this district, Lake Tahoe, Boulder Valley, Portland Public Schools. Just a note, did pass a resolution to formally adopt goals that guide this work. So that's a really important piece, and maybe that's part of your plan. And there's just sort of some key things that I always like to say are that could be part of your plan. Who's the audience? What team is going to help you implement it? What kind of data are you using to create the plan? What are your timelines and what are your goals? So plans might include, I think I've kind of harped on this, but I'll just say it again, you know, your key messaging and your stakeholder documentation, list of relevant goals, documents that you could develop, assessment data, project and or portfolio level goals, and those planning timelines and project lists. I actually thought I deleted that slide, but that's fine. It's a good reference. So you don't have to start from scratch either. We have templates that exist for things that can be utilized in your plan. So for example, I had talked about that resolution. We have a resolutions template that you might be able to use. We have a report template that you can use. There's also owner's project requirements as a template. I don't have a visual of that here, but that's a really effective one. Or it's a planning table, like just creating this trajectory map so that you know where you're headed, where you are and where you're headed. And those exist. There's a link there. That's something we'll follow up with as well. So I'm going to just talk for like a couple more minutes, and then it is all Paul. But I did want to kind of, you know, set the stage here with how we sort of make the case for emissions reductions and resilience. You guys are probably all your like ultimate green team champions. So some of these may seem obvious, but it's something to just kind of call out that these buildings really do help with indoor and outdoor air quality. There's increased student and staff health and productivity. There's so many stories about students and staff wanting to be in their spaces. There's educational benefits. They can create resilient communities. And we'll talk about the resilient communities part in a later session. So we're not going to have a whole lot on resiliency today, but it will certainly come up. And then, of course, reduced energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, which can ultimately save you money and saves our planet. There is a bunch of data that NBI has collected for supporting the carbon neutral and resilience goals. This is just a visual really quickly. The link to that is there. It's also in the link to our full decarbonization guide that has the templates and all of the things. So we will give you all of that. Some of you probably already have it, but if you don't, we will get it to you. So one thing to kind of keep in mind as Paul is going through the whole sort of process of setting up for decarbonization and, you know, goes deeper into the how, it would be great if you all can sort of start thinking about what has been done in your district so far. So what has been done so that, you know, what goals might you have in place, if any? It's totally okay if you don't have any. What is in process and what is being planned so that you know where you can start and where you might want to go. We call this a stock take, where you just kind of take stock of what you have. This is just sort of a visual representation. We do have a long list. I had it in the last session, but it'll be in a follow-up survey that we'll give to you all to fill out so that you can sort of take into account, okay, I have this, I have these goals, I don't have this, I want this. Also, if you were part of the energy session, The survey is about the same. There's just some slight tweaks to it on this one with the emissions aspect. You probably don't need to fill out the survey a second time unless you really want to. All right, next slide. Come on, there we go. So as you're taking into account what you have, what's been done, one of the key things you want to start with here is this stakeholder engagement and this visioning. So you're going to identify the champion, which is many of you. You want to consider who are the decision makers who might actually help you make this plan and who'd be a great candidate for your team. Some of you I know, I'm looking at some names, I know have a great team. I've talked to your teams and they're wonderful. So you may not need to do that yet, but teams can always have more support. You also need to spend some time identifying the core mission or the key drivers and the data that might support it. There are likely many different groups of people like superintendents, board members, or people that you haven't considered. And then we want to also make sure that the building occupants themselves are considered because everyone has a unique need and will be an asset to implementing your plan. And then Paul is going to take us through a visioning exercise today, and it's like a perfect kind of way to help us think about where you might want to go with your plan, or just even beyond this planning exercise too. You know, the whole point of this plan is to get something started or to build on something that you already have started to continue it to grow. But a visioning exercise is something where you're envisioning your sort of perfect school or district to help close any gaps in where understanding might be between your stakeholders. And it's just kind of a way to like storytell, identify synergies or similar goals, and just sort of come to the same place and see that everyone is, you know, everyone's creativity is a core part of achieving your plan. All right, so with that, that is my perfect segue to Paul and talking about reducing emissions in schools and visioning for that emissions reduction. Paul,
Okay, thanks, Riley. Why don't you go to the next slide here? You know, I kind of want to start with this piece of where do you think the future of your schools should be? I mean, what should they look like? You know, what should these buildings look like? And, you know, feel free to kind of think about that. And if you want to put some answers into the chat to get some dialogue going there, that would be great. But you kind of need a vision of what you're trying to achieve here, you know, before you start. And so I'll give you just a second to kind of think through that and let that sink in a little bit. All right, why don't you go to the next slide? So I want to frame this discussion a little bit to start with and think about, you know, even why do we care about energy use in buildings in the first place, right? That it's, you know, buildings, as, you know, all of the buildings in the United States are about a little more than a third. I like to think of these in thirds, right? A little more than a third goes into buildings. A little less than a third goes into transportation. A lot of that transportation is to get us and stuff to and from buildings. And right about a third of it is to make stuff. And that stuff largely goes into making buildings and being housed and used in buildings. So, you know, you can almost kind of frame the entire problem around buildings. But it also is really responsible for 75% of the US electrical consumption. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit later, but I want you to remember that we have electrical infrastructure in this country predominantly because of buildings, right? And about a quarter of the natural gas. And that is predominantly used for heating these buildings. And schools are no exception, right, to these rules. So go to the next slide. When we look at that energy, it is dominated by fossil fuels today. And yes, the renewable energy pie continues to grow and is growing rapidly, especially around wind production in particular. Solar is kind of close behind in its growth rate. The amount of nuclear at one time was projected to be much, much larger, but it's kind of held constant in the high single-digit percentage. And the amount of it doesn't change that much on an annual basis. But it really, that fossil fuel really is all about natural gas and petroleum. And again, that natural gas is, going into heating largely. It's also today going into making, it's the fastest growth rate on the electricity part. So let's talk about, kind of this growth piece of it. And I'm going to throw this statement out there and say that the growth of energy use in this country is still faster than we can deploy energy efficiency. And so go to the next slide, Riley. And this is a graphic that shows how energy has changed in buildings, both commercial and residential, over the last, 80 years or so. And one of the things to note is that, yes, it seems to be leveling off. COVID definitely had an impact in there. We're projecting that commercial is going to go up again this year. But even taking that fairly flat line, if you do a running average of that, it's still on the increase at the end of the day. And so, again, what that means is that we're adding new buildings and we're adding stuff to buildings that use energy faster than we can save it. And so even though we talk about these buildings, being, 50% energy savings, et cetera, it's still making the sector grow. If we had thought about this concept of zero energy buildings, I'll talk more about this in a minute, but it's really balancing, the consumption of the building with renewable supply, most often on site. If we had started talking about that in 1980 and we kind of leveled the graph from 1980 in terms of all new buildings would be zero energy, we use significantly less energy today than we do. But we're not there, and we're not there today in creating buildings routinely that are zero. And we can talk about kind of the hows and the whys, and what is kind of inhibiting that from happening, as part of this discussion. So next slide. And so a couple other things to think about here. One is that every decision you make has an energy or environmental impact, right? A lot of you are in positions of making energy decisions for your schools, but you can even take this to every other decision you make, right? What kind of car do you drive? If you're drinking a cup of coffee, is it in a styrofoam or even paper cup that's disposable, or is it in a cup that's been reused, a mug that's been reused? Right? And depending on how you make those decisions, that has an energy or environmental impact. And you can look at it at everything you do, right? And everything that's in your school building. Design is about making lots of decisions. And if every design decision has an energy or environmental impact, we really need to kind of get to the fundamental basis of how decisions are made in order to make big change. The other part that's interesting is that when we look at those kind of trends, what's going to happen in the future, one of the things to do is look at the decisions we make today in buildings, because that building is going to be around for a very long time. And so those decisions we make, really are mortgaging the energy futures of the world. And that's both decisions with new buildings and existing buildings. Next slide. So, what is, and I put in brackets here, energy and carbon, what is a zero building? And I'll use that term kind of generically. Really, over the last many years, we've used energy consumption, and one of the reasons we focused on energy consumption is that we realize the environmental impacts because of that, right? And it could be early on, especially, it was because of water pollution and air pollution, resource degradation, using a non-renewable resource, all of those things are environmental impacts. And so using that energy wasn't necessarily an issue other than it had all these environmental impacts, right? And today we start talking about carbon usage and emissions from that, as being, in that mix of impacts. And so conceptually, when we talk about zero energy buildings, we're really thinking conceptually about a building that has no adverse energy or environmental impact because of its operation. Now, we also, and we won't get into it too much today, also start talking about embodied energy. That is the energy and carbon expended to make goods and services that go into our buildings. But, again, kind of going back to that initial pie graph, that 40% is just energy going into buildings. And so it is, a huge impact by itself. As we talk about these things, really it's about what energy flows we're measuring. Often we are very selective in those energy flows, basically the energy flows we have to pay for. And the energy sources we're paying for are those that tend to have that environmental impact associated with them. And so that kind of leads to a discussion of what are the boundaries and what are we actually measuring? It's kind of interesting to look at what we're actually measuring. I can't go in front of a building and say, oh, this building is a, polluter, right? It doesn't look like it's polluting. I don't see anything visible that shows me that it's polluting or creating emissions. But I know that because it's using energy, and energy ends up being the thing we measure. We're not measuring carbon emissions per se, we're measuring its energy. And we translate that into other metrics, such as carbon. There's other examples too, right? When we use electricity, we're consuming water. We have to use water at the power plant. When we consume energy, we might be generating nuclear waste, depending on where you are in the country, right? So all of those things, and there are scaling factors for all of those kind of metrics that tie back to the energy that's going through your meter. Next slide. So, when we think about this balance, and it really is a balance, right? That we need to put buildings on a diet. In fact, those buildings need to go on about a 50% diet such that the production with renewables can match that consumption, right? And so it's not just a matter of like, oh, I'll go buy some solar panels and stick them on the roof. You need to look at how much you're using, and at the end of the day, it is about this balance. And so we really need to think about what's lighting our buildings, and the heating and the cooling and the hot water and the fan and all fans and pumps and all the other stuff that we put in buildings, and getting that reduced in order to get this balance. Next slide. So another word that's coming up a lot is electrification. And so I want to talk about that for a moment. I'm going to use an example of a hot water heater, kind of a residential scale. You might have these even in schools, provide hot water for sinks and things, but it's kind of a standard 30 or 40 gallon gas hot water heater. And they're not terribly efficient on their own. In fact, in order to get 1 unit of hot water out, I need to put about 1.6 units of natural gas in. Well, that natural gas doesn't magically get to your building, right? It takes pipelines, and you have to pressurize the gas in those pipelines. You have to get the gas out of the ground. And there's a little bit of energy that has to go into making all that move. And so at the end of the day, we need about 1.74 units of gas going in. I could switch that to an electric resistance hot water heater, and they're very efficient in terms of converting that electricity into heat. And so 1 unit out, I need about 1 unit in. But to make that electricity, and for the moment we'll make it with natural gas, takes quite a bit. It's not a terribly efficient process to convert heat, in this case, into electricity. Somewhere between 30 and 50% efficiency for most power plants, depending on the type of thermal cycle they're using. And so kind of on average, it takes about the same amount of natural gas going in as just burning the natural gas at the bill. In fact, it's slightly more for most of the utility grids in the US. And so you say, well, why would I make that switch at all? This is where the efficiency piece comes in, because the last line on this says, if I go to a heat pump hot water heater, right, where they are much more efficient, they're about 3 times more efficient than electric resistance, then that efficiency makes a big difference, because when I multiply it through the power plant and that electricity, I only need about 1/3 the natural gas going in, compared with a gas hot water heater or even my electric resistance heater. Now, that really plays into why efficiency, but go to the next slide. And what we're going to see here is that if I stick with the gas hot water heater, I really don't have a renewable energy option, right? And we call that direct consumption scope 1 emissions, right? That I've got to really think about how to get rid of that natural gas being consumed on site if I'm interested in having deep reductions in my emissions. So I could convert it to electricity like I did in the last example, and I can go out and I can either put on my roof, or I can go out and buy renewable energy, solar, wind, in some cases hydro. but I need a fairly large system to do that, because if I then focus on energy efficiency, I only need a renewable energy system that's about a third the size because of my efficiency measures. Now, think about that, right? If we were able to reduce the energy consumption of our buildings by 50%, we would double the amount of renewable energy on our grid overnight, right? Because that is going to remain relatively constant. I mean, it is growing, but you're not going to turn that off when you start saving energy. Typically, they're going to turn off fossil generators instead because of the impact and the cost to operate those. Next slide. So heat pumps, I mentioned this before, but they are highly efficient because what they're doing is they're moving heat instead of taking electricity, which is a high grade of energy, and converting it into heat. And so basically, in the case of a heat pump heating, we suck heat from outside. That could be the air, it could be ground, it could be a body of water. And we move that heat to a high temperature, in this case, our building, in order to keep it warm. Heat pumps are typically rated down to about 17 degrees Fahrenheit. But we really need to challenge what's called cold weather heat pumps. There are cold climate heat pumps that will work to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which is sufficient for many of the climates in the US. Now, again, some of this is location dependent. I kind of scanned through who we had on the line. And for most of you, heat pumps is definitely a viable option in order to generate that heat. Now, the good news is you can reverse the process and also use them for cooling systems. There's many different types of heat pumps. I listed a couple here, air source heat pumps. What's very popular today are these mini split or inverter based heat pumps. Often they are ductless or have multiple heads. Ground source heat pumps are also gaining traction in some parts of the country, where you drill wells most often and you pull heat out of the ground in order to put into the building. Why would we do that? Because just like a water pump, it's easier to pump heat when you've got a lower temperature difference. And typically the ground is closer to the temperature we want to heat our building to than the outdoor air. Not always, but most times it is. Next slide. So kind of, bringing this back to school. So one of the things that I hear quite a bit is, I can create these buildings, but what's it going to cost me? And so we did a survey and we ended up with about 90 schools that we had some fairly good cost data on, and scattered around the countryside. And we also compared that with state average costs of building schools. And one of the things that we found is that there was not a lot of correlation between the cost of building the building and the energy use intensity. What we did find is that schools that set goals and set budgets to build those schools could achieve those schools with that budget and meet their energy performance. Now, and you'll see that, yes, there are some schools that are more expensive, and there are some schools that are actually less than the average that still have good energy performance. And in this case, I'd say really good energy performance is something less than 25,000 BTUs per square foot, or the EUI, right? And the EUI is a metric for energy performance. It's not a perfect metric for comparison, but at least it gives a range of, kind of what the expectation is for buildings to operate at. There's a link there if you want to read kind of the detailed report on this. Next slide. And so also coming out of that same report was a discussion about the cost of PV. And what has happened is that literally the cost of PV has plummeted, as well as the cost of a lot of energy efficiency measures over the last 10 to 15 years. And so what we have found is that if you want to add PV to a building, it's actually less cost than what the cost estimating error is before you go to bid on a project. And so the lesson on this is that if you're doing a roofing project, or if you're doing a major rehab to a building, even if you're doing something like redoing the soccer field or parking lot lights and you're tearing up dirt and stuff anyhow, what is the cost of adding PV to the system at the same time? And you may find that, you know, by the time you go out and bond projects and work through all those costs, even if you do it as an ad alternate, you may find that you have enough budget to cover it, because that has gotten to be relatively inexpensive as the project. And at least you've planned for it. In a lot of places, if you can't pay for it, even going through that process, but you're kind of ready for it and have a plan to do it, then you can find other vendors through power purchase agreements or some other mechanism in order to fund that capital to actually make it happen. Next slide. So, you know, existing buildings are always a big question that come up with this. You know, that cost study that we had done primarily looked at new buildings. It's very hard to kind of pinpoint what's going on, you know, and what level of retrofit or rehab that you do. But we did put together some other pieces. And so one of my other big activities is the Better Buildings program at DOE, which does look at some schools. It also looks across the sector for commercial buildings in general. And a piece that we put together last year was basically looking at, if you've got this type of system in your building, what could you change it to, or what can you consider? What is the pathway to go to a, what I call, strategic electrified solution? And so this goes through a list of a whole bunch of different scenarios or different types of heating and cooling systems. In particular, looks at the heating and says, what can I do with that system? Next slide. At least it gives you kind of a starting point to go with that. Another resource that we have that was funded by the Department of Energy, this one was put together by the Department of Energy, but it also was in collaboration with AIA, ASHRAE, U.S. Green Building Council, and the Illuminating Engineering Society. We're creating design guides for zero energy. And again, just because it says energy in the title, is that by reducing the energy, you will reduce your carbon footprint in some way. So the most recent one that we put out was multifamily. So if any of you happen to have kind of dormitory or housing arrangements, there might be some useful information in there. It's also the most recent guide. So you'll notice if you pick up all three of these guides, there's a lot of similarities between them. But the first one we did was specifically on K-12 schools. And so, and in there are about 200 ideas. And I'm going to get to this thing about ideas, you know, and really just brainstorming through what are all the different possibilities of things that I can do to a building. And you'll notice as you go through those, a lot of them do apply to retrofits as well as new construction. Now, you can't really choose the site, right, for an existing building, but in terms of looking at the windows or the lighting, or if you're rehabbing the HVAC, there's lots of ideas in here to help get you started. Next slide. In those guides are target EUIs. And so usually people think about it in terms of site energy. Source energy is energy measured at, say, the wellhead, kind of in that slide I had that includes inefficiencies from the power plant, et cetera. And you'll notice about this on the site energy that most of these numbers, except for the very hot zones and the cold zones are off the end of the page, tend to be in the high teens for schools. And, you know, as you start looking and benchmarking your schools and buildings, you know, that's kind of where you really want to think about being in terms of operating schools, and what is it going to take to get there? And, you know, in making that pathway of saying, what is it going to take? That's where you start getting your list of ideas. Next slide. So, you know, that's all about setting goals, right? What, you know, and I started this discussion about like, what do you want your building to be when it grows up, kind of thing. Being very specific with those goals is great, right? And the nice thing about saying that I want it to be zero energy, or you have a carbon target for your building, is they are numbers that you can achieve. You can go out and measure and decide if you've gotten there, right? That is much better than saying, you know, oh, I want a green building, because, you know, people have a vision, maybe what that means, but it's not specific enough that you can actually take action and measure progress towards that action. Even using a % energy savings from, say, a energy standard or an energy code, which we often see, yeah, that is even somewhat vague in itself, because unless you translate that to a number, once you have a number, now you can go look at your meter and say, did I achieve that at the end of the day? Next slide. So how are we going to do this, right? And how do you think about this at a building level? Now, some of you might manage larger portfolios and can kind of come up with portfolio goals across your school district, and that's great. But at the end of the day, to make a difference, you really need to think about what's going on at the building level, right? How do you make that meter spin slower at the end of the day? And really the district is all about lots of meters that you need to make slower. But unless you work it at a building level, it's really hard to kind of take action that's specific enough to make something happen. And so, one way to think about this is you spend money on buildings every single day, right? And as I said, every decision you make has some energy or environmental impact. And so what changes will you be making to the building as part of normal business, right? And start asking your questions about that. Like, well, when am I going to have to re-roof the building next? Or maybe I've got window films, solar films on my glazing, and I have to replace it every 10 years. Or, maybe, what am I going to do when something dies, right? If I have a hot water heater that dies, what am I going to replace it with? Do I have a plan on replacing it? Or if a gas hot water heater dies, I'm just going to replace it with the same thing that was there, right? Another thing to think about is what problems does your building have, right, that you're trying to fix? It could be water infiltration. It could be comfort issues. It could be, indoor air quality. I know part of this discussion is trying to improve resiliency of buildings, or maybe make them into multi-purpose facilities. So when the grid goes down, I have some other solution, for the community, right? What are the problems I'm trying to solve? And as I think about trying to solve those problems, will it help me in terms of energy efficiency and reducing my carbon footprint? One of the things that you can do with that is, do you know how much equipment actually runs in your building, right? So if I've got something like a gas boiler, do I know what its runtime is on an annual basis? Because if I'm not fully using it and it dies, do I need to replace it with the exact same thing? If the rooftop unit on my gym dies and it's, say, a 5-ton unit, do I have to replace it with the exact same thing, or will a 3-ton unit work? In order to do that, you really need to look at how much does this equipment run and when does it run and why? Next slide. So as an example of that, this actually happened to be a fuel oil burner for a school. And what you see is this kind of average temperature versus the percentage of runtime of that boiler. Now, you start plotting this stuff, and this was actually done with a little inexpensive clip-on data logger. It did not run through an energy management system, although many of you may have this kind of data available. You just have to kind of extract it. But it was done with a very inexpensive data logger that just monitored the motor running on the fuel oil. And so that's where the data came from on percent run times. And there's a couple things you notice. First of all, the boiler's running somewhat when it is warmer than 60 degrees out. Interesting that it was running one day when it was 78 degrees. The other thing that's interesting is the percentage of hours that it's running at less than 10%, which might imply that it's just chugging along fairly inefficiently and could be shut down. But then you also see, we do see a kind of a cloud of values, and it trends upward in runtime as it gets colder out. There is some scatter to it, but when you really kind of start studying this data, you realize that the boiler runtime hours above 60% is pretty small at the end of the day. And it was probably during morning warm-up, which just means started a little bit earlier to get, to manage through some of those numbers. And you have to ask the questions like, well, what if the boiler were 40% smaller? What would happen? Go to the next slide. And so this is an example from a different building, same idea, different way to plot the data, where it was designed, the boiler was sized for 100%. That's what 100% meant, if the boiler ran full time. And this was kind of cumulative annual heat that it put out at those different loads. And what you notice is that above 45% or so, the amount of heat is like in the noise, very small amounts. In fact, even above 30%, it's in the noise. And so then you kind of start thinking and saying, well, If I wanted to replace this with a heat pump system or augment my heating system with a heat pump system, maybe I only need to pay for and design that heat pump for 30% of the load, or maybe even a little less than that, maybe 25% of the load. And there might be a couple of hours that I need to either start the building up warmer, a little earlier is one of the considerations, or maybe I leave the boiler in just for the very coldest times. And there are some equipment out there, the phrase is dual fuel technologies in here. Next slide. And so those are kind of things to start thinking about, in doing this that will really help kind of control the cost. If you go into it and say, oh, I looked at the nameplate on the boiler, and in order to put a heat pump system in at that size, the cost is astronomical, right? That might not be the right question to be asking until you really figure out how big does it really need to be. In some cases, in fact, both of those buildings I showed you, other energy efficiency measures had been put in place, and yet they were running the same old size boiler as they always ran. One of those schools, actually, they had replaced the boiler with, again, like for like, without evaluating what was going on. So, we're going to call this kind of an action plan in thinking through, what you have to do to your building, how might it change, and then brainstorm through a list of solutions. And you might ask yourself a set of questions, things like, what's wrong currently with my windows? Maybe they're fogging up. In this case, maybe the window film is failing. Also, digging into it, we found out that in this particular building, the occupants near the windows were really uncomfortable because they were single pane windows. And so the question is how do we fix that glazing problem and get it insulated at the same time, and maybe put on a permanent window treatment that will block some of the solar gain, right? And so you come up with this list, right? The strategy you want to accomplish, and maybe the next step is just to investigate the cost. But you can then look and say, well, when I get to replacing the windows, what do I have to do? And I'll show you an example of this here in a minute. On the HVAC, if your goal is to, minimize the carbon, you really need to know where your natural gas appliances are, right? And what those electric replacements are. So start easy. Start with something like a hot water heater, like I mentioned before, and say, put that on your inventory list, figure out how big it needs to be, and then say, can I think about putting in a heat pump today? I don't actually have to do it until it dies, but at least then I know what to replace it with when it dies, and I'm ready to go, as opposed to it being a crisis when that gas hot water heater dies, and the only real solution is to replace it like for like. We really want you to kind of avoid using money, in making decisions that don't help you get towards this kind of, carbon-free future eventually. Even things like renewables, right? What does your roof look like? Can you put it on the roof? What's it going to take to do that? And can you investigate the costs of that, as part of it? In reality, you might come up with a list of 50 things to go investigate as part of this action plan. Like, well, what is it going to take to get me to zero? Start making a list for every building. It may not all be achievable today. You may not be able to get the equipment exactly today, but at least you start thinking about a plan to get there. Next slide. So here are some strategies, right? And, I've mentioned some of these before, right? Really strive to get a 50% energy savings. And I just, as a benchmark here, I used ASHRAE 90.1, right? Can you fix your envelope, right? And it may not be even the insulation, right? Take your building and do a blower door test, i.e. pressurize it and figure out where the leaks are and seal those leaks. I put a target CFM per square foot here. And this has been done with existing buildings today, right? And it may be that you find that that's most of your envelope problems, and yeah, more insulation helps, but if you can get the leaks down, that's a big deal. There was a building that we looked at, about a 60,000 square foot, happened to be an office building, and the equivalent hole in the side of the building from the leaks before they started was about the size of a garage door. So just imagine your building with a garage door hole in the side of it. And the question is, how do you go around and fix those things, identify and fix them, right? Lighting is something that gets replaced all the time, right? And if you haven't thought of or looked at replacing lighting in your buildings in the last 3 or 4 years, the the technology has moved so fast and has gotten so efficient that it makes sense to take another look at that. Very popular kind of thing to think about. And in a lot of ways, I was looking at one building where parts of the building were, the lighting was put in 1963. It was fluorescence at that time, even then. And half of the fixtures didn't work. People complained that it was always kind of dark in the space. And we did a lighting retrofit, and it was partially funded by the utility. And they're like, this is great. Now we can actually use the space that we're heating and cooling, right? And it's amazing how many times things like that happen. But you can use the Advanced Energy Design Guide recommendations for what's called lighting power density as a benchmark for that in ways to think about it. Plug loads are often forgotten, right? And this a lot of times is procurement, right? Making sure that everything is Energy Star rated and enabled. That could be computers or refrigerators or, other kitchen appliances, going through buildings and figuring out everything that's plugged in. And then, when you start looking at HVAC changes, if you've touched the first three, that can have a huge impact on the size of the HVAC, which also impacts the type of systems that you can use. Now, Riley's stuck up in the corner, right? How do these impact resiliency of a building? Well, they all impact the resiliency, right? If I can make the envelope better, it is less subject to cool down faster and say freeze when you have a power outage, right? We've actually done studies showing that some of these new buildings, especially those that are meeting passive house criteria, probably will never freeze. Right. Well, that's a big deal in terms of recovery after, an event. Even on the lighting side, right? What daylighting do you have? Are you using your windows for daylighting? Because that could be the first line of defense if the power goes out. And even things like plug loads, moving to things like laptops, are much more energy efficient and much more resilient as well. All these buildings have the ability to maximize on-site renewable energy. And there's another piece of it too, is once you start putting renewable energy on that building, you want to use it. And so there's this funny little thing now that's saying, well, maybe you need to use more energy between 10 and 2, which can help you, think about kind of your demand profiles of your building, and don't use as much energy from 5 to 9 when the sun goes down, and try to better align your renewables with your consumption. We could go all day on that one line there. It can get actually pretty complex pretty quick. If you've got hydronic heating, say, hot water going through your system at 180 degrees, how cold can you make that water? Can you get it to 130 and still meet loads, especially if you fix the envelope? The lower you can make that temperature, the more adaptable that is for heat pumps. And some of that goes then with, and even the shifting of buildings, thermal storage, right? Whether you can preheat the building or pre-cool the building. I saw a couple of you were from humid climates. You might even pre-dehumidify the building or dehumidify the building a little bit more between 10 and 2, and then back off on the cooling system later in the day to avoid afternoon peaks. Hot and cold water is a great thermal storage, right? And just, even just a bigger domestic hot water tank, right? I've got here a little heat pump that provides all my domestic hot water, and I can set it to only run between 10 and 2, and there's enough tank capacity that it takes care of the water load for the rest of the year. It also, you can put buffer tanks in HVAC to make them much more robust and less susceptible to quick changes in the building. Batteries, we're using a lot more batteries, especially for kind of egress in buildings and some of the resiliency and the emergency uses. But I would avoid using batteries to run HVAC. If you need some storage around the HVAC, use water or ice, and let the batteries do what they do best, which are things like lighting and plug loads to operate the building. All this has to do with ways to flex the building load. And some of that strategy is, especially new, is moving towards all electric buildings. But an all electric solution doesn't mean just putting electric resistance in everywhere. In fact, I would try to avoid it. There are some situations where it actually is better, but in general, avoid electric resistance. Next slide. So I'm going to give you an example here as I wrap up my piece of it. And I'm going to give you an example of a little school, elementary school, had a 70-year-old steam system that was failing. Later, a gym was added to the school, and they had a boiler in the same boiler room that was running just the gym. So they had two separate systems. Neither one was redundant, back to a resiliency point of view. And the story started with they wanted to put PV on the gym roof. They thought that would be a good idea and would show kind of their sustainability and get some cost savings. And the vendor came back and said, you can't put it on the roof because PV systems weigh something and you don't have enough capacity. Well, kind of going back and studying on it, what we realized was that the gym roof was failing anyhow. First of all, you don't want to put PV system on a roof that you've got issues with. And so as we looked at it, and there was about an inch of insulation under a tar and gravel roof system. And so what we did was we pulled off the tar and gravel, we pulled off the original insulation, we put 5 to 6 inches of new insulation on that roof, went with a membrane roof, and now I freed up enough weight on that roof that I could put the PV system on. Well, what was interesting about that, by doing that, I also reduced the heating load in the gym in half. And so I'll get to that part here in a second. So let's look at the windows. They actually got a report that said that their windows didn't meet fire egress, and they had to replace the windows in the whole school. And so they replaced the windows with low-E windows, which really reduced the load. And now the steam system that was running most of the old part of the school is way over capacity. And they could not keep the rooms comfortable. And so you could be guaranteed that the temperature was somewhere between 60 and 85, and usually, went between those extremes. So now we had comfort issues in the building because of that overcapacity. Plus, that steam system was failing, and pipes were breaking, steam was being released. They couldn't keep the valves from kind of seizing up, and so they had very little control over that system. And so rather than saying, oh, kind of the short answer would have been, let's fix all the piping and all the valves. Right. Instead, what they went to look at was, let's replace that. And they replaced it with a new radiator system. In fact, they used the return water off of the gym at 130 degrees to heat the entire rest of the school. And they eliminated the entire steam system, which was about 60%, 65% of their total heating load. And now they're heating the building with the one boiler that was designed just for a small part of it, And so what did it take though? It took looking at all these pieces and kind of making a plan long-term on what they could do. Next slide. Now, even though they haven't moved to heat pumps, they have the provisions now to go with that. So I think, Riley, oh yes. So a couple of next steps here, right? Create this action plan, right? To do that, you need to track performance, focus on the energy efficiency, and then identify what equipment you have on site that's fossil fuel and develop some pathways to do that. So next slide. I think I'm pretty much done there. Yes. Okay, Riley, I'll turn it back over to you.
I double muted myself. Gosh, you'd think I'd have that under control by now in 2023. Thank you, Paul. That was great. That was such a great overview. I suspect there might be some questions. So before, we have some questions for you all. However, I would like to yield this time to you instead of us talking at you more. So if you have questions, you can use the chat, you can pop on. You do have access to say hello, so I welcome it if you'd like to. Here's me again. Paul, you can hop on.